Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live hangout. I have decided to start what would equate to 15 seconds early because I do not want to waste a second with today's guest, a very special friend, Dr. Melissa Forbes from the University of Southern Queensland. We're going to be talking to Dr. Forbes in a moment. But I just wanted to say a shout out to everyone. I hope you've had a great weekend. I know many of you are still in the midst of your weekend. So no matter where you are, I hope you're happy, healthy, in good voice. I had a I had a really productive weekend. I did my lawns and I cleaned my cars. Like unheard of. How productive is that? So I hope you've had a great weekend. You know, the bonus of washing the car is I spent my time listening to music. Just I put on a playlist. A playlist of music from my childhood. It was quite nostalgic, and it was great. I mean, it was just I had a great time, and I've cleaned my car to boot, which is fantastic. But we are going to get straight into today's show. We're going to be talking about a number of different things, and Dr. Melissa is such a fabulous researcher, but can I tell you, this lady, she's got some pipes. Melissa can sing, and we're going to talk about her journey as a singer, but we're also going to talk about TV talent shows and the pervasive nature, and you know, it's almost ubiquitous with certain aspects of singing now. And there's going to be an interesting discussion, so I hope you'll hang around because we are going to have a really interesting time, and I think a really informative discussion. And we're going to do that straight after this.
Sound check. Check 1, check 2.
Hello, Melissa.
Hi, Dan. Hi, everyone.
It's so good to have you on the show, and we probably should kick off by saying, and in fact, I've been telling people for the last couple of weeks on the show in the lead up to having you as a guest, that you were very kindly my very first interviewee on the channel. And I had been telling everyone that it was my very first live interview, but in fact, we did it as a pre-record, and we did it December, the video went live December 4, 2014.
You're showing our age,
Our
Dan.
age, yes. I thought you were going to say
See,
my age.
I rock my grey hair with pride. So,
You're...
Look, do you know the reason that I agreed to that, even though it was, not a tried and tested format at that time?
It certainly wasn't.
Because I have so much respect for you and so much respect for your knowledge and expertise that I knew it was going to turn out fine.
Well, that was what we probably would describe as blind faith. But I was very thankful at the time. I'm thankful again that you've come on to the show this time. I've done a few since then. In fact, I was looking just the other day at how many just the live shows, and I think it's well up. It's reaching towards 300 or something. Like it's, silly.
That's amazing. You can do this in your sleep, Dan.
No. Anyone who watches this show on a regular basis knows that I can't do it in my sleep, and that things do go wrong. But I've always got my trusty sidekick Linda in the live chat letting me know that everything's okay. So awesome. I literally couldn't do it without Linda. In fact, a couple of weeks ago I had to do it without Linda, and it was a scary ride. But anyway, so for those of you who want to check that video out, you'll have to really dig quite deep, but just type in Dr. Dan and Melissa and I think it'll come up. And you can look at how poorly edited that discussion was. I went and looked for the date. I didn't even look up what we talked about. Anyway, It's a long time.
It's a deep cut, as they say, in the Voice Essentials archive.
Deep cut, but not deep fake. It was both of us. You know, we may. I mean, you still look as fabulous as ever, but I probably look considerably younger than I do now.
You're very kind.
Oh, we are going to have. I'm so pleased to have you on the show. I can't. I mean, it's embarrassing that it's been taken this long to ask you on for a live. Because you and I have had a sordid history of we've known each other since our uni days, and we both came up under the tutelage of Dr. Irene Bartlett, and but you've gone on to bigger and better things. You're doing all this work up at the University of Southern Queensland in Toowoomba. Just fill us in a little bit, because I mean, you had to update me before the show started, and all the crazy things that you're involved with now. What are you doing with yourself?
Look, my journey with singing as a companion in my life has taken me in all sorts of directions. To kind of backtrack a little bit, I started singing quite late in life, so I didn't really take singing seriously until my late 20s, when I met you through studying, Dan, at the Conservatorium in Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. And at that time, you know, I really wanted to be a performer and a gigging musician. I wanted to learn as much about singing and vocal technique and you know, artistry as much as I could at that time. So that was really my focus, you know, for the first part of my singing career. And I did performance and, you know, recorded a couple of things, and that was all wonderful. Then I, you know, moved into teaching and studio teaching in particular. And, you know, as you know, teaching people about something always teaches you probably more than you teach your own students.
Absolutely.
And it starts to get you on this kind of track of realizing how little you know. And this was, you know, after singing and studying singing for quite a few years already.
Yeah.
The teaching really sparked, I guess, a journey of lifelong learning in terms of this thing that we know and love called singing. And I got an academic position at the University of Southern Queensland. I started casually there in 2009, and then went full-time in 2011. So I've been there for, you know, quite a few years now, and taught, you know, undergraduate singing and various other courses in music. And then when I got my PhD, which was in 2016, I realized that there was this whole other dimension to being an academic that was kind of previously hidden to me. And that was that, you know, as academics, we research things. And I came to realize that there's actually not a lot of research about singing and how it feels to sing and what it means to us to actually sing. So that's kind of where my research journey has taken me. And I'm kind of deliberately conducting research that is not, you know, about vocal technique. It's not coming from that kind of voice science perspective at all. So, you know, in kind of researchy terms, that stuff is quite quantitative and very much within that, I guess, scientific paradigm. And I'm stepping to the other side of the spectrum, and I've become really interested in qualitative research, which really looks at how we experience things in our lives, you know, looking at the stories of people who sing, looking at how people describe their experiences, what value that brings to people's lives. So that's kind of a potted version of how I've gotten to where I am now. Yeah.
And is it I feel like I want to tell everyone that in your life prior to singing, you say that you came to it late. You were a lawyer, a solicitor by trade, weren't you?
I was, but I was a very unhappy one. And so I was very, you know, in hindsight, I was very courageous in stepping away from something that I knew wasn't going to be sustainable for me in the longer term. From a psychological perspective, from just an overall life satisfaction perspective, it wasn't going to be sustainable for me. Economically, it may not have been the best decision to make. But, you know, that stuff isn't ultimately going to make you happy. So, yeah, it was a big decision. It was a big call to make, because obviously it takes a number of years to study and then to become qualified. And I was, you know, actually working. But yeah, I couldn't continue on that path. I had to embrace singing, which was a huge part of, as I've come to understand, you know, my identity. It's a huge part of the way I am in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you say you came to singing late, I take it that, you know, you didn't just wake up one day in 2009 and, oh, I think I'll sing. I especially, and I've had the wonderful pleasure of hearing you sing many, many, many times. And, you know, you were cognizant that you had a wonderful voice that, yes, you know, will have benefited by the refinement of, you know, really actively working on it and in that space. But what had you been doing with your singing, you know, through your formative years prior to that point?
Yeah, I'll say something up front, which we might circle back to, but we're all born to sing.
Yeah.
We are already always singing. That's who we are as people, not just me and not just you, everyone, right? And there were certain experiences in my formative years which affirmed that for me. So when I was very young, I remember I was at home, must have been after school one day, and I turned the TV on, and I can't remember what TV show it was, but you know, I was singing along with the show, and then I turned it off because I knew I wasn't supposed to be watching it because I was meant to be doing my homework. And then I kept singing the theme song, and Mum yelled out, "Turn that TV off!" And like, I'd already turned the TV off and I was just singing the song, so I sounded exactly like, you know, the theme song. And I didn't think it at the time, but I look back on that and I think, well, obviously I must have been a very good mimic to start with, right?
Yeah.
And then there are other things like, you know, being in school musicals where people come up to you afterwards and go, "Oh my gosh, you know, that was amazing."
Yeah.
Like, "Oh, really? Okay, cool."
Yeah.
So there were certainly like a couple of incidents growing up where it was obvious to me that I had a voice.
Yeah.
But then I did okay at school, so I pursued an academic pathway, and just put the singing to one side, thinking, oh, well, you know, just buying into those usual tropes of it's not the way to make money, or it's, you know, it's not a career, it's just a hobby, those types of ways of thinking about it. So, yeah, I think it was always a presence in my life growing up for sure. But there were moments where I was quite encouraged to see myself as somebody who was a good singer. And I know that is a very loaded term, and that's something that we want to talk about today.
It is. Yeah, we are going to get to that because a big part of our discussion today is going to be TV talent shows. And I do want to get into that. But sort of as a segue into that, because we're talking about the research that you've been doing, and it was actually recently you sent me a paper to have a read about, which is what sort of prompted me to ask you to come onto the show.
Yeah.
Because you've been doing some research into TV talent shows, and like you, much of my research in singing, much of my papers in singing have been qualitative, not quantitative. I'm just, you know, captivated by cultural, you know, influences and cultural norms and how they play and interplay. And so, you know, having the opportunity to talk to you about the qualitative research you've been doing is what sort of motivated us. But let's just talk before, let's lay some groundwork around how have you been approaching your research, and maybe that can lead us into talking more directly about the TV talent show.
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. I guess I foreshadowed this before. I feel like there's really little out there about how we experience singing. You know, what does it feel like when you get up and sing in front of a crowd full of people? Or indeed, what does it feel like when you're singing in the shower? You know, what does it feel like when you're singing with a group of other people who all have Parkinson's disease and you have Parkinson's disease? What is that phenomenon? And what does it mean in terms of our everyday lives? You know, does it contribute to a sense of who we are? Does it contribute to a sense of well-being? All those types of things. So they're kind of the bigger picture issues which drive my research. But the other thing that I'm really interested in and kind of fascinated by actually is the fact that, and this is, you know, in the literature, most people think that they're pretty ordinary at singing. You know, and indeed a lot of people actually think that they're tone deaf, when in fact, again, the research is very clear that most people are okay at matching pitch and, you know, holding a modicum of a tune. Like that's, like I said again before, we were all born singing. You know, basically it's part of our DNA.
Yeah.
So it fascinates me that there are so many people out there who think that they can't sing.
Yeah.
And then what does that do in terms of their participation? Well, if I think I'm crap at something, I'm unlikely to do it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, if I think that I'm bad at playing soccer, then I'm unlikely to just get up one day and think, oh, okay, I want to go and play soccer. So I think my program of research is driven by this kind of concern, if you like, that there are lots of us who think that we can't sing, and that's actually cutting people off from participating in one of life's great joys, but also something that's actually really good for health and well-being.
Yeah, I find what you're finding in your research is in complete alignment with what I see in the studio every day of the week. And I have the wonderful privilege of teaching people across the spectrum of singing, from touring professionals right through to people who have literally, in fact, I started with a student last week who was out at a pub with friends, and he was complaining about the fact that he, you know, was bored in life. And his mate said, well, what do you want to do? You know, what do you, he says, well, I reckon I'd love to sing. And so they said, well, just do it. And so right in the pub, he booked a singing lesson. It just so happened to be with myself.
That's awesome.
And it's awesome. You know, I think that's fabulous. And sure enough, you know, we did we looked at the voice and I got him to have a bit of a sing in the studio, and he was able to track notes accurately. But do you think that there's this, it's not that people can't sing, that they don't have the capacity or the ability to, but it's that they feel like they haven't been given the cultural or sociological permission to sing?
Look, I think that's definitely a part of it, for sure. And I also think that people think, no, I know, because this is what the research tells us, that people equate playing music or singing with being a professional musician or a trained musician, right?
Yes.
So unless you have that training or that, you know, long-term experience, most people think, well, then I can't do it, right? And so that precludes people from participating. And in the case of the, you know, your guy having that epiphany in the pub about, right, I want to sing, you know, I don't want to undermine your business at all, but my argument would be, he doesn't have to necessarily have voice lessons to sing. He can just sing, you know, and it's almost like people are, first of all, like you say, looking for permission
Yeah.
from culture or from the people around them to sing. And then second of all, thinking, okay, well, if I've got that permission, then I have to learn how to do it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Whereas I'm like, well, you know, everybody who's able-bodied knows how to walk, and no one's like looking for permission to get up and walk, right? If they are able to do so.
Yeah.
And I make the same argument with singing. Like, it's just, you don't need permission.
No.
And you don't actually need to have lessons.
No.
Unless you're wanting to really, you know, learn the craft of singing. Now, the craft of singing to me is something separate from singing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. No, I actually couldn't agree more. People might be surprised to hear me say that, as a person whose every cent and dollar comes from teaching people to sing. Yeah. But there are plenty of people who do want to develop the craft of singing. But I 100% agree that before that line, there is this whole world of we are all born to sing. Yeah. Yeah. And look, I think, you know, I'm talking about Western cultures here specifically, because I'm not a musicologist, so I don't understand or have a lot of, you know, access to how these things play out in different cultures. But in a society like ours, which is, you know, an Australian culture where we're very much part of that Western worldview, I think, unfortunately, there is kind of a pervasive idea that music and singing are things that are reserved for the elite few who've gone through extensive training and are able to do it well, whatever that means. Yeah. Right. And I just think that's a real shame, because it is a barrier to a lot of people participating in something which they can do. You know? Might I be bold enough to suggest that I don't even know whether it's that certainly there is this group that people see as the elite few who have gone through the training, and this is where I want to bring the TV talent shows in. Yeah, is there is this sense of that there are people you know, who walk among us, mere mortals, who for whatever reason have these voices that we somehow detect or deem as being amazing, and therefore they are somehow society extends the scepter of permission to say, you're amazing. Do you know what you should do? You should go on a TV talent show. So let's dive into the dark world of TV talent shows. And you've been doing a lot of research, and I'll put my hand up and say I too have done some writing in this field, and I ran a show many years ago which was a labour of love called The Fifth Chair, where I analysed 2 seasons of The Voice Australia. Yep. So talk us through what has been your approach to investigating TV talent shows.
So this research sits within that broader picture that I've painted around musical participation. So my collaborator is Dr. Amanda Krause, who's a music psychologist up at James Cook University. And both Amanda and I are interested in everyday musical participation, right? Amanda's particular interest is radio and listening to music, and how that informs the way that we live our lives. And my particular interest, obviously, is singing. So we've kind of joined forces to have a look at, I guess, musical identity as a big concept, looking at the social and the cultural factors which inform the development or not of musical identities. And then within that broader program of research, we've conducted a couple of experiments, if you like, where we've specifically looked at TV talent shows, and we call them, I think, TV singing reality shows or something like that, because I was interested in looking at that as a particular cultural phenomenon, which I hypothesized might be an influencing factor on people's, self-concept when it comes to singing. So, if I'm watching The Voice continuously, does that change the way I think about my own singing and my own ability to sing? Does it motivate me to want to be better at singing? Does it motivate me to want to participate in singing or not? All those types of questions. Another question that we've asked is, when we're kind of bombarded with literally 20 years worth of these shows now, where it's very much a formula in terms of the type of people or the types of voices or the type of singing that wins. And look, again, we were talking about this before, Dan, before we came online. As singing teachers and singers, we're always kind of very careful to say there are exceptions to the rule. So I know that there have been examples of classical singers on these shows or whatever, or, say quite light voices, but in the main, they tend to be singers who have very powerful voices. They tend to be quite dramatic in the way that they sing. There's lots of embellishment, there's lots of melisma. The song inevitably reaches this kind of climax where the audience bursts into applause. It is fairly formulaic. And so if we've been watching that kind of singing being valorized and exalted for 20 years now, do people generally think that that's what good singing looks and sounds like in today's culture? 150 years ago, it probably was more, operatic singing or aria or whatever, or art song, because that's what people had access to, But yeah, that was kind of where it was coming from. It's like these shows have been around for a long time.
Yeah.
Can you believe it? And they are what I would say is, a pervasive cultural influence. And it's not just in English-speaking cultures either. These shows have been rolled out across the globe, and as you know, they've aired in many, 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 many countries, and they attract millions upon millions of viewers.
They certainly do, and in part because for the TV the channel that has taken them on, they are a very cheap program to produce, and at the end of the day, the job of the show is not to unearth this amazing talent. It's to sell advertising space.
Oh, absolutely.
So we have this situation where I think for the foreseeable future, they're going to keep rolling these shows out because, one, they're cheap to produce, and two, we keep watching them, don't we?
Yeah.
Well, I don't. I have to disclaim, I do not watch these shows at all.
Well, I don't watch them either. but I do wonder, what are they going to come up with after The Masked Singer? Like, where do we go from here? I'm not really sure about that.
Well, they came up with, the Masked Singer. What was that one? What was that one called? Where they put celebrities in costumes. And
I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, where do we go from that?
Where do we go?
Because to me, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous on one hand, but it's also interesting.
Yeah.
In that, I suppose the idea is to have the voice kind of speak for itself, rather than how the singer looks or how they style themselves and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's interesting from that perspective, but it's also kind of ridiculous.
The difficulty, I guess, is that the singer as a individual relinquishes all control the moment they step onto these shows, and they actually have no capacity to cut their own path. The path is being cut ahead of them by producers, and they have very, very clever ways of bringing about the result that they would like to steer the show to. We won't go down that path because it's a quagmire, But I am interested in learning about what you've been finding in your research. You've been telling us the questions you've been asking. What have you been finding?
Well, actually quite interesting, really, because I just have to explain how we researched this first. So what we did was we came up with an experimental design where we had a number of recordings of the song Happy Birthday. Okay, so we deliberately picked a song that was very well known, and we got 2 professional singers to sing Happy Birthday, both in the same key. So we gave them instructions to sing Happy Birthday, just unembellished, simple, plain version, right, by professional singers. Then we got the same professional singers to sing it in what we called the style of the voice, or, you know, in the style of these TV talent shows, where we gave them instructions to go for gold, like, you know, put your own spin on Happy Birthday, make sure that you put lots of melisma in there, improvise on the melody and rhythms.
For those watching, just melisma is riffs and runs.
Yeah,
you know,
riffs
where
and
we
runs,
get all the additional R&B notes, you know, that we'd hear Beyonce. She'd be a good example of Christina Aguilera. Think those guys and gals. Yeah.
That's right. So their instructions were then to make sure that it reaches a climax. So their Happy Birthday had to kind of build to this big climax where they hit the highest note.
Yeah.
So I guess we applied that template to Happy Birthday, right?
Yeah.
So there was the professional plain version, the professional embellished version, and then we got 2 amateur singers. So one of them was my husband, who, you know, has never sung professionally or anything, like hasn't had any training, no lessons, no nothing. And then a female amateur singer as well, who was in the same boat, like, you know, has nothing to do with music in their professional life whatsoever. Just the kind of people who would, you know, be at a birthday party and sing Happy Birthday, right? So they were kind of our 3 conditions. And then we also did have, for one of our experiments, we had a control condition, which was me just playing Happy Birthday on the piano, right? So in our first study, we wanted to, first of all, make sure that our participants could tell the difference between those different conditions, which they could. But we also thought, well, while we're at it, let's ask them, you know, how would they describe what they heard and how would they evaluate it? So in that particular study, it was really interesting, actually. So people described and evaluated the amateur and the professional versions, right? And our poor amateur singers were described as being untrained and unprofessional, you know, in the main.
Yes.
Our professional plain singers were described as sounding professional with, you know, nice tone and much better than the amateur voices. And our embellished professional singers were also described as sounding professional, right? So I guess that's kind of unsurprising. But it was really interesting that between like the professional, the voice version and the professional plain version, they were seen as fairly equal in terms of how good they were. So what I was thinking was that the embellished version was going to be like way above in terms of people thinking, oh yeah, that was the best example of good singing. But it actually wasn't. Like, it was fairly even in terms of, you know, people's evaluations of which was the best version.
Yeah.
And then, you know, it was also very interesting the way that people described like the embellished version. Like, a lot of people said it was too much, or I felt like the singers were trying too hard. And that kind of thing makes me think, you know, how much are we manipulated by these shows into, you know, thinking that a particular style is the style that should win the competition, and who at what point made that decision? You know, at what point was it some producer, or what, right at the beginning of all of this, where did that idea come from that, you know, this particular style was the style that was going to be the one that wins almost every single time.
Yeah.
Because people are like, yeah, it's kind of sounds like they're really trying too hard. Yeah.
I think the thing too about, you know, TV talent shows, singing contests on TV, is that there are actually two primary senses being activated. It's not only the audio that we're listening to, but it's also the visual presentation that we are being delivered.
Yep.
You know, and I think if you listen, it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to be able to set up exactly the same experiment that you've done, but to also add the visual aspect of a, you know, the light show and the different camera angles and the sweeping zoom to really do what they do on the TV talent shows and present the voice, the audio in a very particular frame, and which is a 16:9 shot.
Yeah.
I wonder to what degree, and I'm not asking you to answer this because I don't think we can, but unless we were to run the experiment.
Yeah, who's paying for that? That's what I always ask.
To what
degree? Because that's expensive.
Yeah, very expensive.
Yeah.
To what degree does our eyes dominate our ears?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I think that was definitely a limitation of you know, what we did, because we were doing it on no money, obviously. But you're right. Like, there's just so much going on when you're a viewer and you're experiencing these presentations.
Yes.
And, you know, how much does, like, the exertion that the singer's exhibiting, you know, does that play into it? Like, oh, wow, they're really working hard here. They must be really, do you know what I mean?
Yes,
or just the
absolutely.
gestural aspects of it. I mean, there's just so much that's going on.
Yeah.
And, you know, as viewers, we tend to just let that all wash over us, really.
Yeah.
But it has to be having some effect on how we position ourselves within the world of singing.
Yes.
You know?
Absolutely.
And so that kind of leads to the second study, where we were really asking that question, you know, does being exposed to this kind of performance, which I characterize as extreme, I've got to be honest, you know, like, I characterize a lot of the singing on these shows as extreme.
Yeah.
It takes the capabilities of the voice to the far end of the spectrum a lot of the time, right?
Yeah. Well, often beyond what the individual is actually capable of sustaining.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so what impact does this have? What impact, if any, does this have on what I've called singing self-concept? So self-concept, you know, in basic terms is, do I see myself as something? You know, do I see myself as somebody who sings? Do I see myself as somebody who plays the piano, or, you know, can draw, or whatever? You know, is that part of who I see myself as being and you know, existing in the world? And, you know, what we kind of use this, I guess it's a theory from psychology called social comparison. So, you know, when I'm watching TV talent shows, we are engaging in social comparison. We are comparing ourselves to what we're seeing, and we're either going, oh, I think I could do that. I'm really motivated to want to take lessons with Dr. Dan and, you know, really get the most out of my voice. That's one response from that comparison. And the other response is, oh, gosh, I thought I could sing, but I can't do that. So I'm not a singer.
I'm not a singer.
Right?
Yeah.
So this social comparison can be upwards or downwards.
Yes.
And we can respond in those different ways. And obviously one's kind of highly motivating and the other one's very demotivating.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think these are important things to kind of think about, you know, for voice teachers to think about as well.
Yeah.
When we're teaching people, are our students engaging in this social comparison? Well, they will be.
Yes. Yes.
So what impact is that having on the way that they see their own development, their goals in terms of what they want to achieve, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, we found that, you know, to generalize a lot, that there may be some effect between watching, you know, a voice style show or listening to a voice style audio clip, and kind of negative impacts on people's self-concept when it comes to singing.
I guess
I mean, we didn't want to kind of overstate our findings too much.
And the scope of any research paper, ultimately a really great research paper is limited in its scope. So
yeah, that's right.
I guess the challenge, it's this same social comparison that we are all engaged in when we are listening to someone else, or in this particular instance, watching a show. I guess it's that very same comparative analysis that we are internally engaged in that is such a powerful hook to singers when they're contacted by the shows to audition, because suddenly it's the show themselves patting you on the shoulder and going, you're worthy, you know, to at the very least audition. I see this in students more often than I would like to, but and then they're often, you know, promised exposure and these sorts of things. And I don't know whether you've done any research. I'll give you a research idea if you haven't. But I wonder, to what degree does that same process of I've compared myself with others, the show is now telling me that I'm worthy. I'm using the term worthy. It's not very academically robust, but and then to go through the process of audition to then be told you're not worthy, you failed. I wonder what impact. I mean, I've observed this firsthand, so I've seen it on a very small, you know, individual basis. I wonder what impact that has on our psyche as singers.
Well, I guess it depends on the individual, doesn't it? You know, it really depends. Some people are very tied to external validation, and, you know, I think a lot of singers are, speaking generally, and, you know, speaking also from personal experience. There was a time there where I was very much tied to external validation from peers or professionals in the business or whatever. And when what they give back to you isn't what you want to hear, you know, if you're in that place where that's important to you, that doesn't feel good.
No.
So I guess it depends on the individual and whether they're, you know, seeking validation externally, or whether they are very, very comfortable and very secure in who they are as singers, artists, and people. And if you're lucky enough to be in that place, then it doesn't matter what people say about you or, you know, your performance or whatever. But that's something, again, I think is kind of neglected, I guess, in a lot of training that we've received. You know, is how important it is to have that kind of internal security around your own identity as a singer and your own identity as an artist, because if you don't have that, it can be very, very cruel, I suppose, a cruel business to be in.
Could I venture the thought that and this is, again, anecdotally, this has been my observation, but I would venture the thought that it's actually the minority that would not be going into would be going into the show not seeking that external validation, by virtue of the fact that the very thing that is used to hook someone is this idea of exposure. And it's that's actually the deep calls unto deep kind of approach, you know. And so I guess one of the challenges that faces singers who choose to go onto these shows, and I've had this discussion many times with students who have chosen to go onto the show, is to try and orientate them to not, as you are so wonderfully placing it, to not have an external validation. But it's almost like we're playing catch-up football at that point, because we're kind of on that road already by the time we say yes to doing a show like these.
Yeah, but I do think there's a way to participate in anything that's competitive, with the mindset that I'm doing it for the experience, or I'm doing it for what I'm going to gain out of it personally, rather than I'm doing it because I want to win. And if I don't win, I'm terrible.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that's but I think it's a conscious decision that people have to make, and they have to really constantly work on it.
Yes.
So that they can maintain that kind of attitude going into these highly competitive situations. Because as you point out, the whole point of these competitions is to kind of pit people against each other, and to pit the audience, for the audience to choose their horse that's going to win the race or whatever. So they are, by their very nature, like built on external validation. So
and I guess
it takes a strong person to be able to go through that and not get hooked in by it. I agree.
Yeah, and I think any competition, not TV talent shows, but Eisteddfods or national voice competitions or whatever talent shows in general, which I've participated in myself. Any competition of that nature within the world of singing, judging any creative is objective at best. Like it's the outcome, you're being judged. It's very difficult to write set criteria by which you are being judged. I guess one of the challenges of TV talent shows is that objective nature is blurred even further, I think, by virtue of some of the external influences by TV producers, etc.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of circle back to the point of the research that I'm doing, I think that, if our main exposure to singing is within these kind of shows where it's highly competitive and you have to have, a certain level of skill or whatever, that's just really unconstructive and unhelpful in inspiring the average person to become involved in singing. And to me, that's the kind of the great shame of it all, is that, singing should not only just be portrayed in those types of contexts. We need much broader range of portrayals of singing, so that people more broadly understand that they can use singing in their everyday life as a way to actually feel good and to flourish as a human being.
Yes.
And that's what's important to me in my research and communicating that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it harkens back to the discussion that or the terminology used before, and that is, health and well-being. I know for me, I play a social sport, touch football. Many of our international viewers don't know what touch football is, but you would know what touch football is, Mel. And I play it every week. And one of the reasons I play it, it's because it's a social. I'm not very good, but I love it. I love the social aspect. It's great serotonin release for me, and singing in community groups. I don't know. Do you know Emma Dean?
Of course.
Yeah, of course you do.
Goddess.
Cheap Trill is we'll give them a shout out. Cheap Trill is a group I send people to here in Brisbane a lot, because it's just a wonderful thing to be singing in a social context where there's not, a group like Cheap Trill is not audition based. That's not to say that there aren't responsibilities in participating, but it's a wonderful thing to do in community, isn't it? And I wonder, and I think this is correct me if I'm wrong, but the crux of what you're getting at here is that we've kind of lost that, haven't we, in some respect?
Absolutely. I mean, if only we could have as many people in community choirs as we do playing touch football, But see, the thing is, like, people, you don't think, oh, I need to be, a national level
Jonathan
football
Thurston.
player.
I'll give you a name.
Football.
Jonathan Thurston. I mean? Yes.
Yeah. I didn't want to use any names because it's not great for an international audience to use Australian rugby league player names. That's a little bit niche.
Yes,
but
very niche.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, we don't kind of apply those same things to sport for whatever reason.
We don't.
And just because I can't win the Boston Marathon, it's not going to stop me from going and taking a run up and down the street. Whereas I think with singing, we've gotten to this point, and music more generally, we've gotten to this point where it's just like this such a rarefied thing in culture that people just don't even consider it as an option.
Absolutely. No, I agree. And I think singing shows have played their part in I don't think they created this dichotomy.
No, not at all. No.
But I think they have played their part in reinforcing that dichotomy.
I agree. And they really are just one small aspect or one small phenomenon, really, in the broader kind of pantheon of things that influence the way that we think about singing and musical participation. So
So what we do need to wrap it up.
Yes.
Because I've got a student at 2.
No worries.
What is how do we inoculate ourselves against, what is your, in looking at this area of research, are there any sort of noteworthy things that you can share with us that we can do to help us not be beholden to the dichotomy of singer, non-singer?
I think seeing singing as primarily, it's just at its core, it's a physical activity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just like walking or, lifting the shopping bags or whatever. It's a physical function. And if we have a functioning voice, then we have a singing voice. So I would encourage people to see it like that, and to see it as, like in CrossFit, they're always talking about functional movement, thinking about singing as being a functional movement as well.
Yeah.
It's just something that we were designed to do. So just do it.
Just do it.
To steal a branding or marketing phrase. And to just, I guess, what I'm trying to do is just to raise awareness of the fact that, most people can actually sing. People don't need to count themselves out because they're not, winning the voice or, singing in front of a crowd or whatever.
Yeah.
It's a birthright, basically.
Yes.
And we need to reconnect with that.
And that's, we get to land on what I say here on the channel again and again, and that is that singing is a birthright. Absolutely. And I thank you for coming on and reminding us of such. Everyone, I'm sure that you have been encouraged by what Melissa has been sharing with us. Melissa, I noticed that I'd put a spelling mistake earlier on your pronouns as she, he. I've corrected that. It's she, her. But everyone can check out your website at melissaforbes.com.
Yes, and please follow me on Twitter. That's where I hang out most of the time.
Oh, you're a twit.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm a tweeter.
You're a tweeter. So make sure you jump in and check out everything that Melissa has been doing. Mel, thank you for coming on after 8 years.
Well, thanks, Dan. I feel like we could have talked for quite a few hours.
We definitely could have.
Managed to pack a bit in.
And I know that the research is going to continue, so I'll be keen to have you back and just talk further about the qualitative nature of your research and particularly the findings, because I'm encouraged by how the findings encourage people to sing, and that's
right. Yeah,
that's the kicker right there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for having me. Really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
It was so good. Well, there you go, folks. Fabulous to have Melissa come on, and as I said, I've known Melissa for many years, and she just never ceases to amaze me. Her level of intelligence, but the ability to communicate that so clearly, concisely, and with a great deal of accessibility. And so I hope you've enjoyed today's show as much as I have, because I really did. And I hope it's encouraged you. I hope it's encouraged you that it's not just Dr. Dan saying this stuff, that the birthright and, you know, that everyone's a singer. It's being borne out in the research. And I hope today has just simply reinforced that for you. Next week, we're going to be doing a Q&A. And we've got 2 more guests coming up for the rest of the year. I'm very excited about both of them. One of them we've had on the show before. In fact, I've had him on the show a couple of times, Dr. Brian Gill, Professor Brian Gill from the US, and Dr. Lynn Helding. She's going to be talking to us about the brain and singing, well, the mind and singing. I've got to get the terminology right because this lady is a professor of voice and vocology, and it's going to I'm a bit nervous about interviewing her because she's right up there. I'm very excited to have her on the show, and so that'll be in a few weeks. But if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, hit the white bell icon, and that way you will always be reminded that we're going live, which is always Monday, 1 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. So check your local guides. I very much look forward to seeing you again. I'm Dr. Dan. Sing well.